It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Gidon Lev. We're here in your beautiful apartment in Ramat Gan. And Gidon, who was born in 1935 in Czechoslovakia, is an ordinary man, except for the fact that of the approximately 15,000 children who were imprisoned by the Nazis in the concentration camp of Terzin, only an estimated 92 survived. Gidon is one of those children. So Gidon, your former name was Peter Wolfgang Loh, and you were born in Karlsbad in Czechoslovakia. So could you tell us a little bit about your family and your roots?
Yes, I think I can tell. There's a lot to tell. I've been living already 86 years, so I have a lot of stories to tell. But let's go back a little bit to the beginning. I was born in what is in Czech Karlovy Vary and in German Karlsbad in Sudeten, which was part of Czechoslovakia after 1918, but heavily populated by Germans who lived there as citizens of the Czechoslovakian Republic. And they were agitating right from the very beginning that they should be part of Germany. But in 1918, the borders were the natural borders between Germany and Czechoslovakia, which were the mountains and the rivers, and therefore they were inside Czechoslovakia. And that's where a fairly sizable population of Jewish people were living. The Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary, was a spa. In fact, it is a spa to this very day, and there are hot springs there, and you take bath there, and you drink the water, which tastes horrible, but it's supposed to be very good for you. And in 1935, I was born relatively a normal time at the time, except that in Germany, Hitler had just taken power. And we didn't feel threatened because we weren't in Germany. We were in Czechoslovakia. But then came 1938, and with Chamberlain's agreement and the French foreign minister, I don't remember his name, they agreed to Hitler's demand that that part, Sudetenland, as it was called, would be transferred to Germany and there would be no war. Of course, that was totally crazy, because once the day after the signing of that agreement in 1938, the next morning the German army entered Czechoslovakia and once inside. And of course, we as Jews within days felt totally ostracized, totally persecuted. We couldn't, my parents and my grandparents, who owned a old iron lot, that is, they bought used materials, metal materials, and sold them, and they were doing very well. But once Hitler was inside, of course, nobody would sell to them and nobody would buy for them. And then, of course, no Jews were allowed to work in the government. Doctors were not allowed to work in the hospitals. Stores were broken into, and Jews were just totally dehumanized, step by step, day by day. So that on my third birthday, which was in March 1938, I was celebrating still in Karlsbad, and my parents bought me, or maybe my grandparents, bought me a beautiful, beautiful tricycle, red tricycle with black handlebars, and I loved it. But then in June of 1938, my family, my grandparents and my parents got in the middle of the night on a train going to Prague, because everybody felt, oh, the Germans are here in the Sudetim, now they're happy. Of course, this was an illusion. And we, in the middle of the night, got on the train, and I, of course, held on to my tricycle. But my parents said, no, you cannot take the tricycle. We have so many suitcases, so many things. You can't. Only my grandfather stood up for me. He said, oh, come on, I'll hold it for him, I'll take it. No. No is no. So I cried and yelled and made a scene, but it didn't help me. And we got on a plane and landed in 2 hours later in Prague, in an apartment on the 3rd floor. And a month or two later, the German army on the main highway and on the train took over all of Czechoslovakia. And a month after that, Hitler spoke on Hradčany, which was the castle up on the hill in the middle of Prague, that this is now ours, as it should have been, as it was before. And Bohemia and Morava are going to be a protectorate of the German Great Reich. And so it was. And once again, in Prague also, the Jews, step by step, were dehumanized. First, their properties were taken, then their bank accounts, then their stores were broken into, then their movement in the city was limited. They could only go on certain roads. They had to sit in the back of trolleys. They had to be home by 8 o'clock. My grandfather, that I show you right here in our picture, he used to take me to a little park with a swings there and all kinds of things. And I loved one of the swings. It was in the shape of a little boat. And I remember I getting in and he pushing me, and I loved it. Until, of course, the morning came and there was a big sign that said, Juden verboten, Jews are not allowed. And that was the end of my swing. And that was essentially the beginning of taking the Jews from Czechoslovakia, especially from Prague, which had about 70,000 Jews. And they were on a very high cultural and social level. It was probably the creme de la creme of the Jewish population in Czechoslovakia, and started relocating us. And one of the places they relocated us was Terzin, Theresienstadt. Now, Terzin, well, before I go to that, I want to show you, I have here a family tree, and I thought it would be interesting to tell you a little bit about what we have here. If we can take a look at this. So, as you can see, my great-great-grandparents, Leopold and Julie Lenk, she was family name Julie Rosenbaum, had 9 children. And my grandmother was one of them. Which was my grandmother, my great great-grandmother was Rosa, one of them, and her son Fritz was my grandfather. So we have here, this is my grandmother, Fritz, my grandfather. She was Viennese and he was from Karlsbad, and they got married. And actually my grandfather, Fritz, fought in the First World War and was actually in captivity for a year. So that in 1914-15 he went into the army. He was forced to go into the army, and he fought, and he actually returned from captivity with a cross of bravery. And he felt he was Jewish, but he was a German Jew, and he fought for the Germans. Nobody can touch him. Of course, that was also foolish to think that. In any case, there's a whole story going here, because my grandfather divorced my grandmother, and I have absolutely no recollection of either one of them, especially not of my grandmother, because he, after he came back, for some crazy reason, we don't know exactly why, divorced her, and she, who had been taking care of my mother, who is here, for 4 years while he was in the German army, divorced her, and she was sent back to her parents in Vienna. She died in a 1942-43 in a Polish village that the Germans completely destroyed and killed everybody in it. They were mostly Jews. Here's my mother and my father when they got married, and here is one of the last pictures I have of my grandparents on my father's side. This is my grandfather, and you see I'm in his arms. So I have good feelings and good recollections about him. Here's my father, and here's my grandmother. My grandmother actually died in 1941, before she was sent off to Terzin. And then here are all the rest, but that's already...
And Gidon, can I ask, Alfred and Teresa,
Yes,
are they...
they are my grandparents on my father's side. They are his parents.
and above are the pictures.
They had only one son, which was my father, Ernst. Now, after that, in Prague, we were in Prague from 1941 till 1943. What happened then? In 1 second. No, sorry, I have wrong. From 1939 to 1941, 1938, 39, 40, 41. 3 years we were in Prague. And during those 3 years, the Germans simply dehumanized and separated the Jews from the rest of the population. And then they came to the idea, oh, we're going to get rid of all. I mean, this idea was born already in 1935, but we have to get rid of all the Jews. And we will not tell the Jews how we're going to get rid of them, but first we have to separate them. So they decided that all the Jews of Czechoslovakia, and then later on of other countries, would be sent to Terzin. Now, what was Terzin? Terzin essentially was an army camp from the First World War, and it was also a village, a simple Czech village. There were half a dozen barracks, 2-3 stories high, with a central court in the middle, and that's where the Jews were being transferred. And I remember in 1941, in November, December 1941, I was 5 years old, And I was sick all the time with a cold. And I don't know exactly why, but then they discovered that it was because of my tonsils. My tonsils were infected and enlarged, so I had to go to a hospital. So at that point still they allowed Jews to be treated in a hospital, not by a Jewish doctor, but by doctors. And I remember being in the hospital after they removed my tonsils, and my father and my grandfather came to say goodbye to me. Came to say goodbye, where are you going? And they explained that they're going someplace and that I will follow them with my mother, and I couldn't even talk. But they did one thing, they brought me ice cream. The name for ice cream in Czech is a crazy word called zmrzlina. Zmrzlina. That's the only thing I could eat, and I couldn't talk to them. But they said goodbye to me, and they gave me this ice cream, and I ate it. And true enough, 2 weeks later, and I have documentation that proves it, because the Germans at a certain point, or most of the time, kept very strict documents about everybody who was going and coming and where they were going, where they were being sent. And 2 weeks later, my mother and I had gotten out of the hospital already, and they sent us a notification that at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 12th, 1941, we are to appear in the Bahnhof, in the train station, with our suitcases, and we will go and be sent to Terzin, where my father and my grandfather had been sent 2 weeks earlier. So we packed what we could in a couple of suitcases and went to the train station. And if you can imagine a huge train station, at least huge in my eyes, because I was a little boy of 5, people with blankets and suitcases on the floor of the train station, one next to the other, everybody pushing and fighting for a little piece of room to put. We spent, I think, at least 2 days there. There were hardly any toilets there, and whatever toilets there were, you had to wait for an hour or more to use them, because there were so many of us. Some 200, 300 people, children, small children, babies, mothers, no men, and waited till they told us, now you get on the train and we're going to Terzin. And that's what happened. And I remember it was December, it was very cold. Czechoslovakia gets very cold in the winter. And I remember getting off at some train station, because the train tracks didn't go all the way into Theresienstadt. There was no tracks yet. They hadn't been built. So we got off, and with our luggage, and I remember we walked, and my mother had a knapsack and a suitcase and something else over her shoulder, and I was schlepping also a suitcase and a knapsack on my back, and I was so tired, it was so heavy. And I remember one man, I don't remember how old he was, but he was very kind, and he said, maybe I can help you a little bit. And he did. He helped me. He took the suitcase for a few hundred yards, and we walked and we came to Terzin. And as the Germans had promised that we would see our men, our fathers or grandfathers, and for at least 2 or 3 days we didn't see anybody. Then one day, announcement said, all those that want to see their husbands or fathers, look out the windows and you'll see them marching by. And that's exactly what happened. At 6 o'clock in the morning, all, especially us kids, climbed to the windows. There were bars on the windows, and we looked and saw, and I actually saw my father not my grandfather. My father, when I saw him marching by on the street going to work, and they were not allowed to look up. Anybody who looked would be beaten by the rifle butt of one of the German soldiers that were guarding them. And we called, and I didn't see my father look up. I think he was afraid. And that's as far as I remember seeing my father. My grandfather, actually, I don't remember seeing ever again, and he died of some abdominal sickness in the camp. And my father, I remember seeing him physically only twice. Once on the street, and once when he actually got somehow permission to visit us in the barracks where we were staying. You see, the barracks in Terzin, where each barracks was for a different group of people. One was for children under the ages of 10 and their mothers. One was for men only. One was for older people, and so forth and so on. One was for women only. And there was no mixing. There was no getting together. And my mother, each morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, would have to appear in the courtyard together with another 50 or 60 other women, and they would be marched out of the barracks to work. Whatever work there was to be done, they were marched out. And us kids, all of us being less than 10 years, small kids, were left to fend for ourselves. We were not allowed to learn. We were not. From time to time, we looked if we could find some work. For example, I realized that if I could work, time would go by faster, and sometimes it would give me opportunities maybe to get some extra food. For example, when they delivered in their trucks loaves of bread, so I ran to volunteer to help unload those trucks. And I remember holding 6 or 8 loaves of bread. It was very heavy. I wasn't a big kid, I was a small kid. Now I was 7 years old, 8 years old, and unloading. But the trick was that after we finished unloading, there were some wooden barrels there that they had been filled with marmalade. And we quickly learned that if we bought some kind of a dish or something, we could scrape the inside of the barrels and bring a little bit of marmalade to our room. And we were 12 people in a room, 12 people, human beings, that is, children and mothers. And we were constantly, regularly hungry. We never had enough food. I don't know if you can imagine being hungry all the time. I can hardly imagine it today. And today, the minute I feel I'm hungry, I have to eat something. I think it comes from that. People sometimes go through life and they're a little hungry because didn't eat lunch yet or didn't eat supper yet. But to be hungry from morning to night, from night to morning, is a very hard thing to bear.
Gidon, do you remember what type of food they gave you? Besides from the bread, did you get anything else?
Yes, we were given, for the bread, I think we got a piece of margarine. Sometimes also, as I said before, we got a little bit of marmalade, but also we got all kinds of soups made of kohlrabi and made of peels from potatoes. It was very watery, but it was something. The Germans figured out exactly how much calories we needed to stay alive. They didn't necessarily calculate that to stay alive we needed also to have enough strength, especially for the adults, to do some very hard work. Because one of the things that the men did in Terzin was they worked in what do you call it? In mines, but not for coal. They were digging for mica. Mica comes in a form of stones that you can split, and the Germans used it for insulation for electronics. So the men worked in that under very difficult conditions. Not the only thing. They worked on everything, in every other things too. For example, laying a train line all the way to Terzin. But this is something the men did, mining the mica. And then the women, including my mother, would be sitting in these huge rooms with a sharp knife, and they had to split the mica into thin layers. And probably, and this I can't prove, one of the reasons, one of the results of my mother working in this, she must have done enough so that they kept her, because from time to time the Germans did what we call in German Stichprobe. From time to time they checked this woman's amount that she did and this woman's, and if the woman did the amount that the Germans decided was the minimum that she had to do in order to stay and continue working, she stayed, and so did her son or daughter or both. Those that didn't do the amount that the Germans, and only the Germans knew what the amount was. They didn't tell the women. Then the next morning the woman would receive a notice that to report at the train station the day or 2 days after, together with her child. And I have a personal memory that I fell in love with a little girl. I guess she was also 5, 6 years old, but I remember she was very pretty, at least in my eyes. And she was also an acrobat. She knew how to tumble and stand on her hands and do down, and I loved her. Until one day she told me they're going to go away. And I remember I was heartbroken and I cried. And my mother didn't understand. Why are you crying? What's the matter? I'm here. And then I told her, Yalenka is going away tomorrow. And I would never see her again, of course, because being sent away from Theresienstadt to the east meant, especially for children, sure death. Now, I want you to know that in Theresienstadt we did not know for a fact that being sent to east, to Treblinka, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, meant death, almost for sure. We knew it would be bad, we knew it would be worse, but we didn't know that it meant, for most of us, death. Fact is, at the very beginning, the Germans imposed a total isolation of the Jews in the place, and they allowed us to take a postcard that was prepared for us and which we were allowed to send to relatives, and on it was we arrived, we are fine, everything is all right. There were a few young boys, maybe 18, 20 years old, who tried to smuggle out some letters that told the truth. And when they were discovered and caught, the Germans took 16 of those, boys, and hung them in the central courtyard of our barracks.
Did you witness it?
And yes, that's a good question. I sort of witnessed it, and my partner and editor of my book, Julie, said, well, do you really remember? And memory is fickle, and especially for a young child. And I sort of remember my mother pushing my head down as they were hanging the boys. So I cannot guarantee to you today that I actually saw it, but I was there. And the fear and the horror, I have the feeling up to today.
And Gidon, did you see the Germans beat up any of the Yidden, any of the Jews, any of the inmates, any of the...
Actually, in Theresienstadt, I didn't see it. I didn't see people being beaten. People were mistreated. I mean, my mother... Oh, here's an interesting story. My father stayed in Theresienstadt until in the fall of 1944. Then he received a notification that he has to report also to the train. And I remember my mother said, I'm going to go to the train station somehow and say goodbye to father. And she did make it to the train station. And as the train was pulling out and there was a little window, my father threw my mother a little package. And in the package were two things. A photograph of my mother, which he had been carrying with him, which I can show you right here, and this emblem of the town of Theresienstadt. It says Theresienstadt, and it has a date on there, and we try to find out what the meaning of the date is. We don't know. So there were also some Jews in Theresienstadt who I guess were professionals and were able to trade, buy maybe for a piece of bread or 2 pieces of bread and make this. And he threw it out. And here, I think I have the picture. Here, picture that my father one second. Come out. I should keep it separate, but I didn't. No, this is not it. Maybe we have it, or maybe we don't. Never mind. I can't find it. Anyway, my father was carrying a picture of my mother in his pocket, and before the train managed to pull out, he threw this package, and in it this emblem and the picture. And a German officer came and wanted to hit her, but my mother was only 5 feet tall, so she ducked and he missed her and she ran, and luckily he didn't take out his rifle and shoot her. But actually I did not witness beatings.
And what happened to your father? Where did they take him?
Yes, well, that's also an interesting story. So after the war, when in 1945, in May of 1945, the Russian Red Army freed Theresienstadt as they were going towards Prague, because in Prague a uprising took place against the Germans, and the Germans were burning down the city of Prague, building by building, especially the famous historical ones. So the Russians were passing by, and when they passed by our camp, which was surrounded by barbed wire, people at one end started yelling, "It's the Americans, it's the English, it's the Russians." Finally, it turns out it was the Russian Red Army, and the Russians didn't even know what we were. They asked, "What is this?" And people yelled, "This is a concentration camp of Jews." "Oh, we are glad, but we can't stop. So we have to go, but don't worry, we will help you." And they threw chocolate and candies and especially cigarettes. This was worth a lot. And people broke down the fence and climbed up on the trucks. And I remember the Russians catching the last German families of the guards of Theresienstadt and taking them out of the trucks and taking them out someplace into the forest and finishing them off. There was no rachamim. There was no
mercy.
No, none whatsoever.
You remember the day that when the Germans left the camp?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I remember it to very day. By then we were living actually in the same barracks, but very close. We had gotten very close to the fence. So I remember looking down, and there was shooting and noise, and my mother said, "Get away from the window! Get away from the window!" But of course I didn't get away from the window. And then we saw people running down out onto the road, and then people climbing on the fence and breaking it down. And of course I was amongst them too. By then I was almost 10 years old, and it was the Russians. And yes, they freed them. Now, one other interesting thing I wanted to bring out here. I'm going back a little bit because it's an interesting aspect of in 1938, when we moved from Karlsbad to Prague, we had a lot of furniture and belongings and porcelain, and my family was a pretty middle class, non-religious Jewish family. So they arranged to take everything that they could in suitcases, but the furniture and everything else had to be taken by a mover to Prague. So I guess they found a mover and paid him, and he was supposed to deliver everything to Prague, but it never arrived. It never came, and there was no ways we could go back and get it. But after the war in 1945, when we returned to Prague,
you returned with your mother.
My mother and I will fill in here something. My mother took a Czech policeman and went to the mover's house. She had his name and his address, and lo and behold, everything of ours was right there. Everything. The furniture, the porcelain, the sheets, the blankets, and the pictures. In this thing. I have pictures here that are maybe 150 years old. Had he delivered his stuff, this would have never been here with me. So I have here pictures of my great-grandparents. I can show you old pictures. If it ever will come out here.
This is incredible that he didn't throw it away, that they kept it.
It's totally incredible. Yes, this was my grandfather. This is my great-grandfather. This is my mother's half-brother. He was a banker, and he played the viola, and he owned the Stradivarius viola, which also we didn't get back, even though I have a receipt here that he left it with somebody. This was my mother's. Here. This is a picture of my father, and these are his parents, my great-grandparents.
This is priceless.
This is priceless. This must be 150 years old, or maybe 200.
And on the back of it was
yeah, it says Alfred Lev, Teresa Lev.
Carlsbad.
It doesn't say the date. It doesn't say the date. But if it's my great-grandparents, so you can imagine how old this picture already is.
And Gidon, can we see some of the other pictures you had? And this was all inside this little leather.
You can see many pictures, but let me see. Give you some. Okay. Oh, this is a wonderful picture of me. This is before the war. 1939.
It's amazing.
1939. Must have been 3 years old. Yeah, no, 4 years old. Was 4 years old. This was my mother when she was young and pretty. Here, this is my mother with my grandfather's army hat when he was in the army. He must have gotten leave and visited her. Let me just see what else. We have this. Okay. This is a picture of my mother when she was a little girl.
This is absolutely incredible, Gidon.
Yes. This is a picture of a central part of Carlsbad, Karlovy, that still exists. We were there a year ago, and this same area still exists. This is my mother, my grandmother, and a friend of my grandmother.
And it says 1938.
That's right. Before we were shipped out, before we left Carlsbad, going to Prague. Let me just see. Anything else here is interesting? No. Yes, this is my grandfather, same grandfather, with his second wife, whom I of course never met, or at least I don't know that I ever met her. And the reason that my grandfather divorced my grandmother was supposedly because my grandmother was accused of being unfaithful to him while he was in the army. And a cousin who survived, who had gotten to France and survived, said it was absolutely a lie. They were simply jealous of her and destroyed her. She was simply a very sweet, loving, outgoing woman, and his mother, my grandfather's mother, and his sister combined to say that she had been unfaithful. And even though she had been raising my mother for 4, 5, 6 years while he was in the army, my mother didn't go with her mother. She stayed with her father.
It's very unusual.
That's at that time unheard of. Unheard of. But you have to understand something here. My grandfather, her mother, her father married he was a bank manager, and he married the bank manager's daughter. So I think there was some kind of collusion and keep it low and not make noise in the society, and that's why she was sent back to Vienna, and my mother stayed with her father and the stepmother, and my mother was a injured person emotionally long before the Holocaust.
Did your mother ever mention to you that she had regrets that she didn't go with her mother?
You know, one of the regrets I have is that I wasn't able to really have a serious conversation with her about this. I didn't ask, after the war I was concentrating just on staying alive and coping, and I didn't want to talk about the past, and she didn't want to talk about the past. And to this day, especially now after having writing and going into it deeper, there's so many questions I have. So many questions I have. How come she never talked about it? She talked about her father,
But not the mother.
never the mother. How come? How come I didn't have the guts and the thing to say, okay, Mom, come tell me a little bit. One time, I remember, while I was living here and she was living already, she was still living in Canada, I tried to poke at her, but mostly about her father. But I did it in the wrong way. I attacked her. I said, but your father, she was so protective of her father. But he took care of me, he sent me to a military school, but he looked after me. So that I didn't get anywhere. And I take it's my fault. I didn't understand how hurt and how difficult it must be for her to remember her mother, who was taking care of her for 4, 5, 6 years. So that by the time she came to a concentration camp, and afterwards, I can tell you here that after the war, in 1945, a few months after the war finished, we came first to Prague, and we didn't know who was still alive.
Just you and your mother?
Yes, my mother and I came to Prague, and we were searching, who's alive, who's coming back from.
You didn't know what had happened to your father?
So my mother said that some men, some friends she knew, told her that my father died on a death march. On a death march, you know that the Germans, as they were retreating, those people who were still alive and could walk, they took them partially probably for their own protection, so the airplanes wouldn't shoot them. But recently, a year ago, we went to Yad Vashem and we did some research, and it turns out that my father didn't die on a march, that he was in Auschwitz, that he had been part of a medical experiment, and that he was sent at a certain point to Buchenwald, but it's unknown whether he got there and died there or he died on the way. So for years, my thinking was, my father died on
And you only found the site a year ago when you went to Yad Vashem?
Yes. Because we wanted to check a number of things. We wanted, for example, I never knew anything about my grandmother, my mother's mother, the one that was sent to Vienna. And finally we find out that in 1943 she was sent to Zabeka, someplace in Poland, to a village that was all Jewish, and there she was shot or burned or whatever they did to that entire Jewish village. I never knew about it. And there was a building, you know, in Vienna, every Jew, or at least most Jews, who had been living in a certain building,
They have the brass.
in a brass
I've seen
plaque
it. I was there.
on the sidewalk is the name of the person, and the date of birth and the date of probable death and where.
And they have one for your grandmother.
And I saw that.
You went to Vienna. You saw.
I went to Vienna. Yes, not with Julie. I went to Vienna with somebody else, but I saw it.
Did your mother ever go to visit her mother in Vienna before the Shoah?
I think, if I recall, that my mother said, "I took you once as a baby to see your grandmother," but of course I have no memory of that at all. I'm not sure. I cannot vouch for it because I was too small. It's possible that she visited her mother once. It is possible. Is it likely? We will never know.
And Gidon, did your mother ever remarry?
Yes, my mother remarried, and that is actually the reason why we moved to Canada. You see, in Brooklyn, New York, I had a great-grand aunt. She was one of the aunts, Flora. You see, circled Flora?
Yeah.
She was a great-grand aunt who was living in East 21st Street, Brooklyn, New York. And she, after the war, was searching for any of her relatives who remained alive. Now, she was living together with a cousin who was taking more or less care of her, because by that time, in 1948, she was already 80 years old. And she found my mother and me. So, after waiting for 2 years or 3 years to get permission to enter the United States, because the Americans didn't just say, "Oh, come to America, we'll receive you." They had a quota, only a certain amount of Jews that survived could come to America, and only if they had somebody there who would vouch for them. And my great-grand aunt vouched for us. And 2 years later, one day in 1948, in the spring of 1948, we received the notification that our number has arrived, and we got onto a train for Paris and a ticket on the boat, the SS America, Queen of the United States. And 7 days later, we arrived at New York Harbor with the Statue of Liberty, disappointingly small in my eyes, there for us. And we arrived there, and I lived there. And my mother had become friendly with this man whom she had known before the war, him and his wife. And he survived, but his wife and his son did not. So he could not get into America because he had nobody there to vouch for him, but he could, by hook and by crook, get into Canada. You see, the Canadians are a little bit silly and unknowledgeable. His name was Julius Kohn, Kohn. And a cousin of my father's was married to a man called Frank Kohn, but spelled Cohn. But my stepfather said, "Oh, Kohn, I'm a brother of him." So the Canadians, Kohn is Kohn. C-K, what's the difference? Of course, there's a world of difference, two different names. So he managed to get into Canada. And therefore, in 1949, after a year in Brooklyn, New York, we moved to Toronto, Canada, and they got married and lived together till he died.
Did they have any children together?
They had no children together.
And was he good to you, your stepfather?
Very good question. He wanted to be good to me. My mother didn't allow him to. She was an injured person. She couldn't understand her. She couldn't allow somebody else to be my father. He wanted to be good for me. And when I knew him before we moved to America, I remember going with him to the villages on a bicycle and getting fresh milk and fresh butter. And I remember that he used to find old bicycles and take them apart and put them together, and he would teach me what to do. But in Canada, she cut him off for me. She cut him off, and I feel badly about that, because he was a good man.
And you were happy that your mother got remarried?
I was glad, yes, but they were both injured. They had a very rough marriage. Sometimes I couldn't stand it.
So, your mother, she never spoke about Czechoslovakia, about the war, about Terzin?
No, not with me. I remember for a while she went to psychiatrist, but she never spoke about it.
Did she associate with friends who were also survivors?
No, I don't think so. She had some friends, but I don't think they were survivors. It's one of the sad part of my life that I had such a difficult mother. She made life for me hell.
But you know what the miracle is? That she stayed with your father and she survived, and you survived. If she would have gone back to Vienna,
who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows? We will never know. Yes, you're quite right. There are all kinds of things that happen that there's always action and reaction, right? And this is true also with my mother. But my mother was very authoritarian. If you can imagine me, I'm thin now because now I lost some weight because of age, but I was never a fat person. I was always, but I was good. Would stand over my table when I was eating and make me finish to the last drop everything that was on the plate, whether I liked it or not liked it.
Maybe that's because of the war and the deprivation.
She was a very, very harsh woman. But let's jump a little bit forward to one thing that's important. How did I get to Israel? What brought me here?
You came here, I think, in 59.
What?
You came here in 1959.
I came here in 1959. How come? What brought me here to Israel?
And before you answer, I just want to ask you, before you tell us this.
Go right ahead.
Just going back to Terzin, do you remember when the Red Cross came?
Yes, I do. I was one of the kids that was taken by a truck to a playground in the middle of the village and said, oh, swings and this and that and schaukeln, and you could play. And the distance from here to that building where the Red Cross with their cameras taking pictures of how the Jewish children are playing in the playground. Of course, the minute they went away, it was out of our reach again. The Germans put up a 100% convincing show. They even printed money.
Yeah, I've seen them. I had money. I had that money.
Yeah, well, they printed money like monopoly money. They opened a couple of shops with clothing. Where did the clothing come from? The clothing came from the Jews in Theresienstadt. They simply taken it, put it on shelves, and people were encouraged to go buy yourself a shirt, maybe some socks, maybe underwear. It was all make-believe. And the Germans, with their instinct for diuk, for exactness, precision, believe me, they did it very well. And they had a lot of people fooled. Yes, look, we are resettling the Jews. They're governing themselves. Yes, we're governing ourselves. But the chief governor was the commander of the concentration camp, and he did what he did, and every one of them was finally gassed or shot.
So, Gidon, this is the most amazing thing, that out of the 15,000 children that went through Theresienstadt,
only 90 some who
it's just
survived.
incredible. And you're one of those 92.
Yeah.
That is the most.
I don't think we know exactly the number. I think it's.
But it's approximately.
Approximately, yeah. 1%.
So Theresienstadt wasn't such a good place. Theresienstadt.
Anybody tell you it was a good place?
No, they said this was the model. Or the
yes, but there were no gas chambers. But they were building a gas chamber. I remember they took us one day, the entire population of some 15 or 20,000 people, out of the camp and marched us for hours out into a huge field. And in that huge field was a huge underground tunnel, like air raid shelter, huge. Of course, in my eyes, being a little kid, may not have been quite as big as my imagined that, but it was huge. And they all got us, get in there, get in there. They didn't tell us why. This was to a trial to see how much time it would take for emptying all the Jews of Theresienstadt and putting them into a gas chamber that they had started building but hadn't finished. I remember it. I remember. Whoa, should we take suitcases? Should we take our jackets? Just take yourself and go forward.
And Gidon, have you ever gone back to Terzin?
Oh, I've been there a total of 1, 2, 3 times, 3 or 4 times.
Was it very emotional going back?
It was the most emotional the last time when I went together with Julie. It was the most emotional the last time. And that's for a number of reasons. Because, first of all, because Julie is very insightful and knows how to ask the right questions. And we talked together and saw it, and I was more aware, I was more conscious of what I was seeing. It was very emotional. But I also must say, 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, I had taken my oldest grandchildren, 4 grandchildren, and my oldest grandson and his wife also on a 9-day trip to Czechoslovakia. We also went to Terzin, and it also was emotional. But now they have updated it in many ways, and now you can see the beginning of rejuvenation of Theresienstadt. Little cafes opened up in the shadow of these barracks, and you can see the barracks slowly falling apart. And we went into the Kleine Fest, the actual prison, which was the horrible place where they kept political prisoners, but also Jews who did something that brought them there. It was a terrible place. and you could see how horrible this place was. The commander of the small prison there, it's not so small, it was sadist. He enjoyed beating people to death. He enjoyed. And I think 1 week or 10 days before the end of the war, they shot or hung something like 15 prisoners. So, yeah, it's very, very very, very difficult. Also, in going through the small prison, there were groups there, and Julie told 1 or 2 of the groups, "Oh, here's Gidon. He's a survivor here." And all of a sudden, 15, 20 people start asking a question: "Where were you? What did you do?" And I had an exchange, a physical exchange, and they were, I guess, amazed.
You see a survivor from Terzin.
Yes, it's right here amongst them. So yeah, it was quite emotional. I also did something else with Julie. There was a village in Czechoslovakia called Lidice, which was not Jewish, which the Germans leveled to the ground as a revenge for the assassination of Heinrich Himmler. I'm not sure it's the right name, who was the commander of Czechoslovakia, a horrible person. And they decided to kill everybody, or almost everybody, nothing to do with Jews. And it just shows how bestial, how inhuman the Germans were. They killed all the men, shot them, put them against the wall, first 6 at a time, and then the ricochet from the bullets, they had them bring mattresses, put them against the wall, and then they put 10 at a time, shoot them. I mean, you have to think of who are these soldiers doing this? They weren't even Jews. Most of the children were sent to the gas chamber. The women were sent to the chamber. They chose a dozen or so children who looked Aryan. Blonde hair, had no signs of being Slavic, and sent them to Germany to be Germanized. They grew up as Germans. They didn't even know that they were Czechs. And I took Julie there because I felt there's a connection here. The bestiality and the horror of the German Reich was not limited to us.
What's amazing is that the Czech people have always had an affection, a closeness to the Jewish people.
I think amongst the Slavic nations, the Czech nation was the least anti-Semitic.
They helped in 1948 they were the only country that gave Israel armaments.
Correct.
And Masaryk was very close with the...
Yeah, it was right in Machane David, the airport, the airfield in the Jezreel Valley.
And even to this very day, the Czech Republic is very close to Israel, and they stand up in Europe for Israel.
Yeah, I hope so.
The foreign minister was here a few weeks ago, and it was amazing. He really stood up for Israel. I just want to ask you, Gidon, what you went through, did you lose, or how did you deal with having faith in God? It's a very difficult question.
Okay, now you're getting into trouble.
I know it's a difficult question. I know it's very, very hard.
I tell you.
And it's a very sensitive question.
I'll be very straight and forward with you. In 1945, after the war, when we went back to Prague first, and we were waiting to hear from my father or grandfather or anybody, I used to pray every morning, like a nun, to get on my knees and pray, Lieber Gott, dear God, bring my father back. And my mother, La Gabi, she was not supportive. She said, what are you doing? Get up. Don't, let me, it's crazy. And after that, she was totally not supportive of me and my pain. And I said to myself, in my heart, in my mind, I don't know if there's a God. I can't believe in a God, because if there's a God, how can He allow such things to happen? Take away my father, my family. It must be terribly cruel, God. I can't believe in a God like that. And I didn't. And actually I don't.
But look, you came to Israel, you're living here.
Okay. Now that, you see, is the second part of the story. The second part of the story is I got bitten by a Zionist movement. At that time, not Hashomer Tzayir, but I can show you a picture actually. Dror Hechalutz HaTzayir, which was close to Hashomer Tzayir, but not the same. And I went to summer camp, Moshava we called it, and I went to winter camp. And I had a shaliach from Kibbutz Hachotrim, just near Haifa. And we practiced defending ourselves with a stick because we didn't have guns. And he told us, we were going to have a country. We're just going to do it. We need it. We deserve it. It's ours. And I got totally convinced by that. So that when my mother decided and we received permission to come to America and not go to Israel, I said, but Mom, I want to go to Israel. I said, please, we're going to America. And Flora is waiting for us. So I went to my shaliach, Zev, and I said, Zev, what am I going to do? I want to go to Israel. He said, Peter, that was my name. At that time it wasn't Gidon. Peter, don't worry. There's also a Zionist youth movement in America, and you can get there from America. Just be patient. And I did. I arrived in New York in June 1948, not knowing English. The only thing I knew was an English song, My Bunny Lies Over the Ocean.
Sure.
And I was living in the middle of Brooklyn and went to movies. I saw Superman, Superwoman, Batman. I came home. I said, Mom, Aunt Flora, what is this? My aunt, my cousin, Leonie said, no, they don't really fly, they don't really go see. This is all make-believe. I couldn't understand it because I couldn't understand the language. And then I started going to Prospect Park, which is a big park in Brooklyn. And I saw kids playing, hitting a ball with a stick. So what kind of crazy game is that? And I saw throwing a football. Looks like a banana, fat banana. So that is not a game that I know. What am I going to do? Then one day, I'm standing there, I see some kids playing soccer, playing football. This is a game. So I stood behind the goal, and every time they missed the goal, I ran, kicked the ball back to them. Finally, after 20 minutes, they said, "Oh, come, join us. You're Jewish, no?" I said, Jewish. "Well, we have a club here on 2nd Avenue, Brooklyn. Come, Friday night, Erev Shabbat, come. Here's the address." And I went. And that was HaShomer HaTzair. And from there, HaShomer HaTzair, Toronto, Hachshara, Chicago, 1959, SS Zion brought me to
Unbelievable.
and Kibbutz Hazunea.
Gidon, I just want to thank you so much. I'm going to just, 1 second. So Gidon, it's been the greatest honor and privilege to be with you. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you so much for, this has been unbelievable. And your story is, in my opinion, Nissim. If I can just hold, to think that your mother, she was a courageous woman, to go back, and that you've got this, the original, from it's just miracles that they never threw it away.
They never threw it away.
And you've got the original pictures of your family.
Yeah.
So Gidon, I want to thank you so much. It's been for me the greatest honor and privilege to be here.
It's been an honor and privilege for me to have you speak to me and ask questions.
So Gidon, I just want to thank you so much. I just want to ask you one last thing. What message do you give your grandchildren and the future generations? What message do you give from your incredible experience, what you've seen, what you've gone through?
To make the most of life. We do not choose necessarily the life we want. We live the life we get and try and make the most of it. As it is, when it is, where it is, and how it is.
Wonderful. Gidon, thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome. I'm flabbergasted that you want to speak to me.
Gidon, it's been the greatest honor. And I'd maybe string till 120 in Mazel Brocha.
It's too low.
It's not, and just have Mazel and Brocha and just nachas from your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Believe me, I do.
God bless.
I definitely do.